In the previous chapter, we introduced the concept of headroom, the kind of gap, if you like, between the loudest moment on an individual channel and then signal overload. And what we discovered was that so long as we're kind of in the green, no individual channel will overload. But we also discovered that the moment that we sum the outputs of a couple of channels, we can very quickly end up in the red at the output stage, because all of that volume being added together produces overload and distortion, which often isn't tonally beneficial to our tracks. Now, if we were working in the good old days of analog consoles, where every sound that we wanted to record or track or hear was passing through an individual channel strip of an analog console, what we would have at the top of every single one of those channel strips would be a gain stager. So effectively, we've got a gain control which is affecting the input volume. In other words, the way that the volume is introduced to that channel, which then passes down through all of the different modules or stages of that channel before it reaches the volume fader at the bottom. Now, this is a really important point. Gain is effectively the input volume, and volume, the fader at the bottom of a channel, is controlling the output volume. Now, the reason why this matters so much in the digital workspace is that actually we don't really have gain inputs in the way that we used to. So if I take a sound like the Omnisphere sound at the top here, which I already know has the potential to overload right at source, I can see that I don't actually have a gain stager within Logic, and indeed within most workstations, which allows me immediately to kind of trim or manage the gain of this channel. In other words, the input into this Logic channel strip. So what I need to be doing is managing gain at source within the plugin itself. And we saw in the previous chapter how within Omnisphere, what I'm in a position to do is to come into the plugin itself and come and find the gain control, which is going to allow me to manage volume, or indeed to use the output volume in order to make sure that the volume coming into Logic isn't overloading. But if we were going to go for a sort of true gain staging approach, what we're effectively looking to do is to try and make every channel within our project the same volume at source. Volume is impressive. Loud things impress us, and quiet things make us sort of think, well, okay, that sounds not particularly interesting. So really, in order for our mix to have a foundation where every sound has an opportunity to kind of shine and flourish, what we need to do is to be managing gain. And one way that we can do that is to use a gain plugin at the top of every channel strip within our project. So within Logic, what I could do would be to come into here and come into the utility folder where I'm going to find a gain plugin. And this effectively allows me to manage volume at source before I do anything else. So in other words, before I use an EQ, which is going to take individual frequency groups and turn them up or down in volume, before I use compression, which is going to change the average volume of a sound as it plays back, almost every plugin you can conceivably add to a sound is going to change its volume in some way, whether that's a reverb sharing dry and wet balance between processed and non-processed sounds. Volume is changing all the way through the processing of sound. And what we have a chance to do with the gain plugin is to sort of manage the input level of that sound at source. So what I could do with my plugins here would be to say, okay, what I'm looking to try and do is to create a kind of equilibrium of volume across all three sounds that I'm using within my project. So firstly, what I could do would be to audition my sound. Now, I already know that within Omnisphere, I've dramatically changed the kind of gain staging of my sound. So what I'm going to do is to take this back to more or less where it was to start with, and I know that this signal is overloading. But what I could then do would be to say, okay, I'm going to use the gain plugin to reduce volume. Rather than using Omnisphere to do it, I'm going to use the gain plugin. So what I can then do is to audition the sound and go looking for a kind of gain that allows me to create an even volume across the different sounds that I'm going to be using. So let's firstly set a benchmark with this first sound. Okay, so by holding it down, what I'm in a position to do, sustaining this sound, is to sort of set a benchmark which is around -9 dB. Now then, there's not really going to be a precise science to this, because this sound is highly likely to be controlled by velocity. In other words, if I hit a note really hard, it's going to be louder than if I hit it gently. And also, the very nature of plugins is that they're not going to be completely consistent in the way that maybe just a sine wave tone, which might be how we sort of calibrated analog consoles in the past, where we we had a complete consistency of volume the whole time, so that we were able to go through one channel after another and set gain so that it was completely even across a board. That's maybe not going to be available here, but within reason, what we can do is to begin to emulate that behavior so that we're kind of setting that benchmark for the signal flow of all the sounds within our mix. So I'm going to play the sound again and see where exactly I've got output level set. Yeah, so it's somewhere between sort of -9 and -10 dB. Okay, well that's a useful place for me to start. What I'm then going to do is to mute the bass line for a second, and I'm going to put a gain plugin on my sampler as well. Now, I know that I've programmed velocities that are at the upper end of this particular sound for this kick drum. So what again I'm going to do is to see if I can use the gain control to sort of equalize the volume of this channel too. Okay, so again, I've set myself about 9, 10 dB of headroom on this particular track. And then I can do the same thing with the bass. Again, I'm going to just mute the kick, so I'm focusing on one sound at a time, and we'll do the same thing. Again, I'm going to set up the gain plugin, and we'll just sort of balance this so that we've got the headroom built into our project. Okay, so there's some give and take within the signals, but nevertheless, what we've done is to set an individual gain control for each of those 3 channels, which is effectively managing the volume of them at each stage. And if we open up all 3 of them, I think we'll discover that we've got quite a lot of change in terms of the way that volume is being managed. The Omnisphere sound is having nearly, or in fact just over 10 dB of gain removed, the kick drum 6.8 dB, and this bass line -3.6. So these differences, once I've set them up, I can forget about them, because effectively what I've done is to create an evenness of volume across the 3 channels, and I could do it subsequently for any other sounds I add. And what that then means is that I can leave the gain plugins in place. I know that what they're doing is to basically provide me with a, relatively speaking, a consistency of volume. And crucially, that means that for the sort of foundation of what I'm then going to go on to do in terms of processing these sounds is that effectively they're all starting from the same sort of benchmark volume. Now, there's one crucial thing to say, which is that it's really tempting when you're working with any workstation to assume that the way that volume management is best done is simply to grab the volume faders at the bottom and to adjust those. So in other words, I can achieve an equilibrium of volume across these 3 sounds simply by grabbing the volume faders and turning them down a certain amount. Well, that's not the same as controlling the input stage. What we're doing within Omnisphere, for instance, is we're basically saying, okay, this signal is overloading, and what I want to do is to stop that happening at the input stage. That's different from this signal is overloading, and the way that I'm going to address that is to turn its volume down at the end, keeping all of that overloaded signal in place, but simply reducing its volume. In other words, if I get distortion as a result of the fact that the sound is overloading at the input stage, I'm taking my distorted signal and I'm turning it down with a volume fader. That doesn't get rid of the distortion. If I want to get rid of the distortion, I need to change the sound at the input or gain stage. And that's what gain staging is, making sure that at the input stage, we're regulating volume across whichever channels we've got within our project.